February 2, 1943. General Friedrich Paulus signed the surrender document with a trembling hand. Outside, 91,000 German soldiers, frostbitten, starving, some so weak they could barely lift their rifles, stumbled into Soviet captivity. The temperature was -30 degrees Celsius. 3 months earlier, those same men had marched into Stalingrad believing they would crush the Soviet Union in weeks. Now the 6th Army, Hitler's most elite fighting force, had ceased to exist. But here is what nobody told you. That catastrophe didn't begin on the frozen banks of the Volga. It began in a single decision, made in a warm Berlin office by a man who believed his willpower could override mathematics, logistics, and the Russian winter combined. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. His name was Adolf Hitler, and in 1939 he controlled the most feared military machine on Earth. Within 6 years that machine would be reduced to rubble, and the story of how it happened is more brutal, more fascinating, and more instructive than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. This is how Adolf Hitler lost the Second World War. August 23, 1939. 2 men sat across a table in Moscow and signed a document that shocked the world. Nazi Germany's Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov pressed their pens to paper, and in doing so, created an alliance that nobody on Earth believed was possible. Fire shaking hands with ice. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact declared that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other. Publicly, it looked like a diplomatic masterpiece. Secretly, it was something far darker, a deal to carve up Eastern Europe like a butcher divides a carcass. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, all divided on hidden maps, split between 2 dictators who despised everything the other stood for. Hitler didn't want peace. He wanted time. Germany in 1939 was powerful, but not ready for a 2-front war. Hitler had written it clearly in Mein Kampf. His vision was always the East, always the conquest of Soviet territory, always Lebensraum, living space for the German people. But he needed Western Europe subdued first. The pact with Stalin bought him exactly that window. 1 week later, September 1st, 1939, the Wehrmacht crossed into Poland. Cities burned within hours. The Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky in formations so tight they darkened the sun. German armored columns moved with a speed that Polish cavalry, literal cavalry on horses, could not match. Warsaw, a city of over 1 million people, was surrounded in weeks. Poland, a nation, ceased to exist in 27 days. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days after the invasion began. Hitler had expected it. He didn't fear it. Not yet. Because Blitzkrieg lightning war was unstoppable. May 10, 1940. Germany struck westward. The Netherlands fell in 5 days. Belgium in 18. And then France, supposedly the most formidable land army in Europe, protected by the legendary Maginot Line, a fortress of concrete and steel stretching hundreds of kilometers, collapsed in 46 days. 46 days. The Maginot Line didn't fail because the Germans broke through it. They simply drove around it, through the Ardennes forest that French commanders had declared impassable for tanks. General Erich von Manstein's armored units poured through that impassable forest like water through a broken dam. June 14, 1940. German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. A swastika flag was hung from the Eiffel Tower. Hitler flew to Paris at dawn to survey his conquest, standing before the city in the gray morning light, with the expression of a man who believed he had already won the war. He hadn't. He had only won the opening act. Across the English Channel, something was happening that Hitler had not fully calculated. Winston Churchill had replaced the appeasing Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister, and Churchill's first message to his people contained exactly 0 language of surrender. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He promised to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and streets. He promised Britain would never surrender. Hitler launched Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade Britain. But first, the Luftwaffe had to dominate the skies. From July to October 1940, German and British pilots fought one of the most extraordinary air battles in history. Young RAF pilots, some barely 20 years old, flew 4 missions a day. They were outnumbered. They were exhausted. But they were defending their homes, and they refused to break. The Messerschmitts fell. The Heinkels fell. And slowly, painfully, the Luftwaffe's losses mounted beyond what Germany could sustain. Churchill immortalized those pilots with 11 words: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Hitler could not break England. Sea Lion was quietly shelved. And that failure, that single inability to crush one island nation, pushed him toward the decision that would ultimately destroy him. June 22, 1941. 3,300,000 German soldiers crossed the Soviet border simultaneously. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was the largest military invasion in human history. Hitler was certain it would be over in 3 months. His generals had been promised a swift campaign. The Wehrmacht had crushed France in 6 weeks. Why would the Soviet Union last longer? The early results seemed to confirm everything. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions tore through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Minsk fell. Smolensk fell, Kiev fell, and with it an encirclement that captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers in a single battle. By autumn 1941, Germany had advanced further into enemy territory than any army in modern history. But every kilometer conquered was a trap Hitler was digging for himself. The supply lines grew longer and thinner. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had planned for a 3-month campaign. It had packed for a summer war, not a winter one. And Stalin, after the initial shock, responded with something that no German war planner had adequately modeled: the willingness of an entire nation to bleed indefinitely rather than surrender. He ordered scorched earth, crops burned, bridges destroyed, factories dismantled and shipped by rail to the Ural Mountains, reassembled in freezing conditions by women and children working around the clock. Wells poisoned, villages razed before German units could occupy them. The Soviets sacrificed their own land to deny it to the enemy. Then autumn arrived. October 1941. The roads of the Soviet Union dissolved into mud. The Wehrmacht had a name for it: Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Tanks sank to their axles. Trucks could not move. Horses, thousands of horses, were used to drag artillery pieces through the mire. The unstoppable war machine ground to a halt. And then the cold came. -20 degrees. -30. Weapons froze. Engine oil solidified. Soldiers who had marched from France in summer uniforms now wrapped themselves in whatever they could strip from Soviet civilians. Frostbite took fingers, toes, noses. Men froze to death in their foxholes overnight. Hitler's generals begged for permission to establish defensive winter lines. Hitler screamed, "Not one step back." Meanwhile, Soviet troops from Siberia arrived at the front, men who had trained for exactly this kind of war, wearing the right boots, the right coats, their weapons lubricated with winter-grade oil. In December 1941, for the first time in the entire war, the Wehrmacht was pushed back. Not retreated. Pushed back by force. The myth of German invincibility cracked for the first time. Hitler's response was to fire his generals' men who had executed some of the greatest military victories in modern history. He replaced them with ideological fanatics willing to execute suicidal orders without question. He declared himself supreme commander of the army. A man with no military training beyond the rank of corporal in the First World War was now personally directing operations across a front stretching 3,000 kilometers. The Third Reich had reached its high watermark. It controlled more European territory than Napoleon at his peak, but it was already beginning to die slowly from overextension, from scarcity, from the mathematical impossibility of sustaining a global war on 3 fronts, with an economy that could not match the combined industrial output of Britain, the Soviet Union, and soon the United States. One city on the Volga River was about to prove it beyond all argument. Its name was Stalingrad. And what happened there, what Hitler ordered, what Paulus obeyed, what 300,000 German soldiers experienced in the frozen ruins of that industrial city, would become the moment the entire world understood that the Third Reich was not invincible. It was dying. And in Part 2, we will watch exactly how that death began, street by street, house by house, floor by floor, in the bloodiest urban battle the modern world had ever witnessed. In Part 1, we watched Hitler's war machine tear through Europe with terrifying speed. Poland crushed in 27 days, France broken in 46, the swastika flying from the Eiffel Tower. Then came the turn east, Operation Barbarossa, 3 million soldiers crossing into the Soviet Union, and the first cracks appeared. The mud came. Then the cold. Then Stalingrad loomed on the horizon like a gravestone the Wehrmacht didn't yet know had their name on it. Now we enter the city itself. And the number you need to understand before we go further is this: 91,000. That is how many German soldiers walked out of Stalingrad alive, out of 300,000 who went in. This is where the Third Reich began to die. September 1942. The German Sixth Army arrived at the edges of Stalingrad with absolute confidence. General Friedrich Paulus had received his orders directly from Hitler: take the city. Hold it. The city bore Stalin's name. Capturing it would be a psychological hammer blow against Soviet morale. Strategically controlling Stalingrad meant controlling the Volga River, the main supply artery feeding the Soviet war effort in the south. Cut the Volga, and the oil from the Caucasus stopped flowing. Without oil, Soviet tanks stopped moving. The logic was clean and simple. But war does not reward clean and simple. Luftwaffe bombers arrived first. On August 23, 1942, they reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble in a single day. Over 1,000 sorties. Entire city blocks collapsed into each other. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure on the southern edge of the city, caught fire and burned for days. Thousands of civilians died in the streets. Hitler's commanders looked at the burning city from their command posts and assumed the job was essentially done. They were wrong. The rubble didn't clear the path for conquest. It created the perfect battlefield for defense. Every collapsed wall became a sniper's nest. Every shattered factory became a fortress. Every basement became a command post. The T-34 tanks that Soviet defenders were using couldn't be outflanked in narrow streets the way they could on open steppe. German Tiger tanks, fearsome in open ground, became slow, blind targets in the urban labyrinth. The Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without killing their own men. Artillery was nearly useless at ranges of 50 meters. Vasily Trikov, the Soviet commander inside Stalingrad, understood something that Paulus did not. He ordered his men to hug the German lines, stay so close to the enemy that German air support and artillery became impossible to use without killing Germans. He called it clutching the enemy by the belt. His soldiers moved through sewers, basements, and tunnels. They appeared fired and vanished into the ruins before German units could respond. The battle became something that no military academy had ever taught, and no war game had ever simulated. Soldiers fought for individual rooms inside individual buildings. A staircase would be held by Germans, a floor above by Soviets. Grenades were thrown through holes in ceilings. Men used sharpened shovels in hand-to-hand combat because rifles were too long to swing in the darkness. A single city block sometimes took days and cost hundreds of lives to capture, and then it would change hands again the next morning. The grain elevator alone held out against repeated German assault for weeks. 18 Soviet soldiers against hundreds of Germans fighting from grain storage chambers, keeping the position alive through sheer refusal to accept that they were supposed to lose. When German units finally broke through, they found the building nearly empty. The defenders had slipped through tunnels in the night. The Soviet factory district became the most savage battlefield in human history. The tractor factory, the Red October steel mill, the Barricadi gun factory. each one a kilometer-long complex of industrial buildings converted into fortified positions. Workers who had been building tanks were given rifles and told to defend the machines they had built. Some of them fought in their factory overalls for weeks before dying at the workbenches where they had spent their civilian lives. German soldiers developed a name for this nightmare. They called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. By October, Paulus had captured roughly 90% of the city. His men had fought their way to the banks of the Volga in several places. Soviet forces were compressed into a strip of riverbank, sometimes less than a kilometer deep. Reinforcements crossed the Volga at night, under fire in boats on rafts, on anything that floated. German artillery targeted the crossing points day and night. The river ran black with oil from sunken vessels, and red with the blood of men who never reached the far bank. Paulus reported to Hitler that final victory was days away, again and again, for weeks. Meanwhile, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov was building something in the steppes north and south of Stalingrad that Paulus and Hitler had fundamentally failed to account for. While the Sixth Army ground itself to powder inside the city, the Red Army was quietly massing over 1 million soldiers on the flanks. The German lines protecting those flanks were held by Romanian and Italian divisions' allied troops, who were less experienced, less equipped, and far more thinly spread than German units. Zhukov called his plan Operation Uranus. November 19, 1942. At 7:30 in the morning, 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously on the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Then Soviet tank columns punched through gaps torn open by the artillery. The Romanian lines didn't hold, they disintegrated. Soviet armor streamed south, at speeds that German intelligence refused to believe were possible. 2 days later, a second Soviet force struck from the south. On November 23rd, the two arms of the Soviet pincer met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The entire German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, their equipment, their supplies, their artillery, was trapped inside a pocket of frozen steppe and burning city. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out westward before the Soviet ring hardened. Hitler's answer arrived within hours. Capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army will hold its positions. Göring, the Luftwaffe commander, had promised Hitler that his air force could supply the trapped army by air a minimum of 300 tons of supplies per day. It was a promise built on fantasy. The Luftwaffe managed an average of 94 tons per day in conditions where frostbite was grounding pilots and Soviet anti-aircraft fire was shredding transport planes on approach. Men inside the pocket received rations that amounted to roughly 200 calories per day. They ate horses. Then they ate rats. Then they ate leather from their belts boiled in water. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. A relief force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein came within 48 kilometers of the pocket in December. Paulus could hear the distant sound of artillery. His officers begged him to break out toward Manstein to abandon the city and save the army. Hitler forbade it. Paulus obeyed. Manstein's force was pushed back. The last chance closed like a frozen door. By January 1943, the pocket had shrunk to a ruin. German soldiers were dying at thousands per day, not from battle, but from starvation, exposure, and disease. Hospital bunkers overflowed with men who had no medicine, no heat, and no hope. The city they had fought to capture had become their mass grave. January 30th, 1943. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a gesture loaded with dark implication. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was a command disguised as an honor. Paulus surrendered the next morning, February 2nd, 1943. The last German units in Stalingrad laid down their weapons. Of the 300,000 men who had entered the city, approximately 91,000 survived to become prisoners of war. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity from the same starvation and cold they had inflicted on their enemies. The myth of German invincibility was not cracked at Stalingrad. It was shattered completely, publicly, and permanently. Every soldier in Europe on both sides understood what Stalingrad meant. The Wehrmacht, the force that had annihilated Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and driven to the gates of Moscow, had been surrounded, starved, and destroyed. Not by a superior technology, not by overwhelming numbers at the point of contact, but by a strategy that turned Hitler's own rigidity against him, and by Soviet soldiers who endured conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Hitler locked himself in his headquarters and told his generals the loss was their fault. But in the cities of the Soviet Union, in London, in Washington, and quietly in the homes of ordinary Germans who had begun receiving death notices from the Eastern Front, people understood the truth. The tide had turned, and somewhere north of Kursk, Soviet engineers were digging the deepest, longest defensive network in military history. Because Zhukov knew that Hitler, humiliated, furious, and desperate, would strike again in summer 1943. And Zhukov intended to be ready. In Part 3, we will watch that strike arrive, 3,000 German tanks rolling toward a trap so perfectly constructed that the battle was decided before the first shell was fired. Parts 1 and 2 brought us from Hitler's lightning conquests across Europe to the frozen catastrophe of Stalingrad, where 300,000 German soldiers were swallowed by a city they thought they had already broken. The Sixth Army surrendered on February 2, 1943. The myth of German invincibility died with it. But Hitler refused to accept that the war had turned. He needed a victory. One massive, undeniable, crushing blow that would silence his own generals, terrify Stalin, and prove to the world that the Wehrmacht still owned the Eastern Front. He chose Kursk. And here is what you need to know. Before we enter that battlefield, the Germans assembled the largest concentration of armored force in the history of warfare for this attack. Over 3,000 tanks, 900,000 soldiers, 2,000 aircraft. Hitler called it Operation Citadel. He believed it was unstoppable. The Soviets knew it was coming 6 weeks in advance. After Stalingrad, German intelligence watched Soviet lines with growing alarm. The Red Army that had encircled the Sixth Army was not retreating, it was expanding. New units appeared from the east, fresh, well-supplied, equipped with American trucks from the Lend-Lease program, and Soviet T-34 tanks rolling off reassembled factory lines in the Ural Mountains. Soviet production in 1943 was outputting 2,000 tanks per month. Germany was producing 330. The arithmetic of industrial war was becoming impossible to ignore, but Hitler ignored it anyway. His generals presented him with a plan in spring 1943. Near the city of Kursk, Soviet lines bulged westward in a massive salient, a protruding arc of territory roughly 250 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep. The plan was to attack both shoulders of that salient, simultaneously cut it off at the base, and encircle the Soviet forces inside. Clean, decisive. A return to the encirclement victories of 1941. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein wanted to launch the attack in May, before Soviet defenses solidified. Hitler delayed. New Tiger and Panther tanks were coming off the production lines, and he wanted them in the assault. May became June. June became July. Every week of delay was a week the Soviets used to dig. And Zhukov dug like the earth itself was his weapon. Soviet engineers constructed 8 separate defensive lines inside and behind the Kursk salient, extending nearly 300 kilometers in depth. They laid over 500,000 mines, roughly 2,400 anti-tank mines, and 2,500 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. Trenches stretched for over 5,000 kilometers in total length. Artillery was pre-positioned in interlocking fields of fire designed to destroy attacking armor from multiple angles simultaneously. Soviet intelligence, aided by the British cracked Enigma intercepts, knew the exact date, time, and axes of the German assault. Zhukov told Stalin directly, let them attack first, absorb the blow, bleed the panzers dry, then counterattack. July 5, 1943. 0430 hours. The German assault began. Panzer divisions rolled forward on both flanks. Army Group South under Manstein from the south. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Günther von Klug from the north. Tiger tanks led the formations their 88mm guns, capable of destroying any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The ground shook under the weight of steel. German commanders had seen this before the moment of breakthrough, the gap tearing open, the enemy collapsing. The mines hit first. Tank tracks shredded. Vehicles slewed sideways and blocked the advance of units behind them. Engineers moved forward under fire to clear paths. Soviet artillery, pre-sighted on exactly these approach routes, opened up simultaneously. Shells fell with a precision that German officers described as unlike anything they had encountered before. Because it was targeted. Because Zhukov had spent 6 weeks calculating where the Germans would be, and he was right. In the south, Manstein's forces made the deeper penetration roughly 35 kilometers into the Soviet defensive network over 9 days of brutal fighting. Each defensive line was torn open at enormous cost, only to reveal another line behind it, equally prepared, equally deadly. German tank losses mounted daily. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly. Soviet replacements arrived faster. In the North, models assault ground to a halt within days. The terrain was worse, the defenses deeper, and Soviet General Rokossovsky had deployed his anti-tank reserves with surgical precision. German armored strength in the north was effectively broken by July 10th. Then came Prokhorovka, July 12, 1943. South of Kursk, near the small rail station of Prokhorovka, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps encountered the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, moving directly toward them. Both sides were attacking simultaneously. They collided at close range in what became the largest single-day tank engagement in history, over 1,000 armored vehicles locked in combat across fields that rapidly filled with burning steel and black smoke. At Prokhorovka, the Tigers' long-range advantage disappeared. Soviet T-34 commanders drove directly into the German formations, so close that the Tigers couldn't depress their gun barrels low enough to engage. Soviet tanks rammed German tanks. Crews that survived the initial collision climbed out and fought each other hand-to-hand between the burning hulks. The air was so thick with smoke that pilots above couldn't identify friend from enemy. By evening, the field was covered in destroyed vehicles from both sides. Soviet losses were severe, approximately 300 tanks. But Soviet tank production could absorb that loss. Germany lost over 400 tanks at Prokhorovka and could not. The SS Panzer Corps, the most elite armored formation in the German military, had been fought to a standstill by an enemy that had been written off as broken just 7 months earlier. 2 days later, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel entirely. The news traveled through Wehrmacht units like a cold shock. Every German soldier who had fought toward Kursk understood what cancellation meant. This was not a pause. This was not a regrouping. The largest German offensive since Barbarossa had been stopped cold, not by luck, not by weather, not by terrain, but by Soviet preparation, Soviet production, and Soviet soldiers who had learned from 2 years of catastrophic defeat exactly how to destroy a German armored assault. The Wehrmacht never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk forward, the strategic reality reversed completely. Soviet forces began Operation Kutuzov on July 12, the same day as Prokhorovka, striking the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient while German forces were still exhausted from their own attack. By August, Soviet forces had recaptured Orel. Kharkov, the city that had changed hands 3 times, fell to Soviet forces for the final time on August 23, exactly 2 years after Germany's deepest penetration into Soviet territory. German losses at Kursk exceeded 200,000 casualties and over 700 tanks permanently destroyed. Soviet losses were higher in raw numbers, but Soviet industry replaced them within weeks. German industry could not match that pace under the Allied bombing campaign that was systematically dismantling Reich factories from above. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Wehrmacht officers who had served since 1939 began privately telling each other what they could not say aloud. The war in the East was unwinnable. Supply lines were too long, Soviet production too vast, and Hitler too rigid to adapt. Every strategy required flexibility. Hitler's command style permitted none. In Berlin, Goebbels's propaganda machine attempted to frame Kursk as a planned withdrawal. German newspapers did not publish casualty figures, but soldiers wrote letters home, and families read between the lines of the careful language that men used when they knew the censors were watching. The mood in German cities shifted from confidence to a quiet, unspoken dread. Meanwhile, events in the Mediterranean were accelerating the collapse. In July 1943, as Kursk raged in the East, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Mussolini was removed from power within weeks. Italy, Germany's primary Axis partner, was switching sides. Hitler now faced the prospect of defending northern Italy with forces he could barely spare from the eastern catastrophe. The war had become a siege of the Reich itself, tightening from every direction simultaneously. But the question that historians have asked ever since, is this what happened to the man who made all of this possible? What was Hitler's psychological state in the months after Kursk as the walls closed in? And what decisions did he make in that darkness? Decisions that would shape the final 2 years of the war and determine how many millions more would die before it ended. In Part 4, we will enter the bunker. We will trace the final chapter of the Third Reich, not through the grand sweep of army movements, but through the decisions of one increasingly paranoid man who refused to accept what Stalingrad and Kursk had already proven beyond any doubt. The war was lost. The only question left was the price of the ending. We have traveled far together, from the signing of a cynical non-aggression pact in August 1939, through the lightning conquest of France, the frozen catastrophe of Stalingrad, and the tank graveyards of Kursk. We watched the most powerful military machine in modern history rise, stretch beyond its limits, and begin the long, irreversible collapse. Part 3 ended with a question: what happened to the man at the center of it all, when the walls finally closed in? Here is the answer, and it contains a detail that most people who study this war have never fully reckoned with. Because Hitler's final chapter is not just a story of military defeat. It is a story of what happens when a man builds an empire entirely on his own ego, and then refuses to let anyone save it from him. After Kursk, the Hitler who appeared in photographs and newsreels was visibly transformed. The man who had posed triumphantly in front of the Eiffel Tower in 1940 was gone. In his place stood someone aged beyond his years, left hand trembling from what doctors privately identified as the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease, eyes that had lost the electric certainty of his early speeches. He moved through his headquarters at Rastenburg, the wolf's lair, buried in the forests of East Prussia like a man haunting his own life. He dismissed generals at an accelerating rate. Anyone who delivered honest assessments of the military situation was accused of defeatism and removed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed twice. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most gifted operational commander of the war on either side, was finally relieved of command in March 1944 after pleading repeatedly for a coherent defensive strategy. Hitler replaced him with Walter Model, a man whose primary qualification was a willingness to obey orders without argument. The generals who survived did so by telling Hitler what he wanted to hear. And what he wanted to hear was that the war was still winnable, that secret weapons were coming, that the Allied coalition would fracture, that destiny would intervene. Meanwhile, the Allied intervention he feared most arrived on June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord put 156,000 soldiers on the beaches of Normandy in a single day. Hitler, convinced the landing was a feint, and the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, refused for critical hours to release the panzer reserve that might have pushed the landing force back into the sea. By the time the order came, it was too late. The beachhead was established. Paris fell to Allied forces on August 25, 1944. The liberators who rolled down the Champs-Élysées were driving through the same streets where German soldiers had marched 4 years earlier. The Third Reich was now compressed from every direction. Soviet forces, energized by the industrial output that had been relocated behind the Urals in 1941 and had spent 2 years producing at scales Germany could never match, launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war. In 2 months, it destroyed Army Group Center almost completely. German casualties exceeded 400,000. 28 German divisions were effectively annihilated. The Red Army liberated Belarus and pushed into Poland. On July 20, 1944, a German colonel named Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase containing a bomb under a conference table in Hitler's headquarters and walked out of the building. The explosion killed 4 people. Hitler survived because another officer had inadvertently moved the briefcase behind a heavy table leg before the detonation. The blast flung Hitler across the room, perforated his eardrums, and temporarily paralyzed his right arm. His response was the systematic execution of everyone connected to the plot, real or suspected. Over 4,900 people were killed in the purge that followed. The German officer corps, already hollowed out by years of impossible orders and dismissed competence, was now also living under the threat of execution for insufficient loyalty. The Wehrmacht's capacity for rational military decision-making effectively ended. By early 1945, the geography of the war had compressed to something almost unrecognizable. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine in March. Soviet forces had crossed the Oder in January and were less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany's air force no longer functioned as a coherent fighting force. Its navy had been driven from the Atlantic. Its cities were being destroyed from above in systematic raids that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and obliterated the industrial base that sustained the war effort. Hitler retreated into his final fortress, the Führerbunker, a reinforced concrete structure buried beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin. From that underground space, surrounded by a small circle of loyalists, he continued issuing orders to armies that existed only on maps formations that had been destroyed weeks earlier. Divisions that existed as names on paper, but had no soldiers, no equipment, and no ammunition. April 20th, 1945. Hitler's 56th birthday. The Soviet artillery bombardment of Berlin began. The sound reached the bunker as a constant low tremor in the concrete walls. Officers came and went, offering birthday greetings with hollow formality, while the city above burned. Hitler sat in his Situation Room and moved phantom units across his maps with a trembling hand, ordering counterattacks that no one could execute. Eva Braun had joined him in the bunker. She refused to leave despite every opportunity to do so. Whatever one makes of her choices, she made them with full knowledge of what was coming. On April 28th, Hitler dictated his political testament, a document remarkable primarily for containing not a single word of responsibility or regret. He blamed the war on international Jewry. He blamed the defeat on the weakness of the German people, who he declared had proven unworthy of his vision. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and Goebbels as Reich Chancellor. On April 30th, 1945, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his private rooms. Eva Braun took cyanide simultaneously. Their bodies were carried into the Chancellery Garden, doused in petrol, and burned as Hitler had instructed, apparently aware enough of history to know what had happened to Mussolini's corpse when Italian partisans hung it from a lamppost in Milan 2 days earlier. Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children that same evening and then took their own lives. The children's names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. The youngest was 4 years old. They were killed because their mother believed that a world without National Socialism was not worth living in. This detail, more than any other, reveals the true nature of what the Third Reich had made of its true believers. Berlin fell on May 2nd. Germany signed unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The accounting that followed was staggering in its dimensions. Approximately 70 to 85 million people died in the Second World War, roughly 3% of the entire global population in 1940. The Soviet Union alone lost an estimated 27 million people. Poland lost approximately 17% of its entire population. 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Roma disabled people, political prisoners, and Soviet POWs were killed in the same system of industrialized murder. Germany itself was divided, occupied, and rebuilt under foreign supervision. The country that Hitler had promised would rule Europe for 1,000 years was partitioned into 4 zones of occupation and would remain formally divided for 45 years. The cities that had been symbols of German cultural achievement: Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne. Berlin itself lay in ruins. And here is the detail that most retellings overlook: the thing that makes this story not just a military history, but a lesson about the nature of power itself. Hitler did not lose because the Allies were lucky. He did not lose because of weather or because of a few critical mistakes that could easily have gone the other way. He lost because the system he built was structurally incapable of winning a long war. An ideology that demanded total loyalty over competence, that purged anyone who delivered honest information, that concentrated all decision-making in one increasingly irrational mind. That system was always going to fail. The only question was how much it would destroy before the failure arrived. Every general who told him the truth was fired. Every institution that might have checked his worst decisions was dismantled. Every mechanism for course correction was eliminated in the name of absolute leadership. And so, when reality finally arrived in the mud of the Soviet autumn, in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the minefields of Kursk, on the beaches of Normandy, there was no system capable of adapting to it. There was only one man alone in a bunker moving imaginary armies on a map. The Third Reich lasted 12 years. Hitler had promised it would last 1,000. From a failed artist who slept in Vienna shelters in 1909, to a man who controlled more European territory than Napoleon at his peak, and then lost all of it, along with his life, the lives of his closest followers, and the lives of tens of millions of people who simply had the misfortune of living in the century he inhabited. That is the final answer to the question we asked at the beginning. How did Hitler lose the Second World War? He lost it the same way he won his early victories, through the force of his will, overriding every rational voice around him. Except that in the end, the force of his will ran directly into the mathematics of industrial production, the endurance of the Soviet people, the resistance of the British, and the manufacturing capacity of the United States. And will, no matter how absolute, cannot defeat mathematics forever. If this story made you think differently about how power fails, share it. History is full of these warnings. We just have to be willing to listen to them.